Have you ever sat through a local government meeting? A board of supervisors, city council, something like
Ooh,
that.
yeah.
And you watch them just breeze through this huge chunk of business when the chair says, we'll now move to the consent agenda.
And it's so fast. A motion, a second, a vote, and suddenly dozens of items are done.
Exactly. Feels incredibly efficient. But, then you stop and think, what exactly just got bundled together there?
That speed is the magic, and, well, it's also the problem, isn't it? As someone who's paying attention, you get that feeling of progress, but you immediately have to wonder, what was tucked inside?
And does all that efficiency come at a
The
cost?
cost to oversight, yeah.
And well, that's exactly what we're digging into today. We've been unpacking a stack of sources, looking at this procedural tool, the consent agenda.
Sometimes called a consent calendar, especially how it's used in places like Pennsylvania's second-class townships.
And we're really focusing on that core conflict the research highlights,
Yeah.
efficiency versus transparency.
Yeah, we pulled one quote that it captures the tension perfectly. It says, "A consent agenda is a tool, not a shortcut around transparency."
So we need to analyze what the rules are for this tool, and I think more importantly, where those rules start to break down in the real world.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start simple, the basic definition. A consent agenda is just a way to group routine, non-controversial items together.
Right, so they can all be approved with just one motion, one vote. You get to bypass all the separate discussion for each little thing.
It's the ultimate streamlining tool for the parts of the meeting that everyone just expects to pass easily anyway.
Right. And while the second-class township code in Pennsylvania doesn't specifically define it as a procedure, boards are allowed to adopt their own rules for
No,
megs.
but there's a big catch.
There is. The absolutely non-negotiable rule is that every action, no matter what, has to comply with the state's foundational law, the Sunshine Act,
Which means,
which means the votes have to be public.
yeah,
And residents have to be able to see clearly what decisions are being made. You can't just hide business by bundling it.
the information has to be out there quick.
Precisely.
So if we look at what's considered, appropriate for a consent agenda in a PA township, we usually see a list.
Uh-huh.
Things like approval of the minutes from the last meeting, the routine bills lists, accounts payable,
Standard stuff.
standard professional invoices for the engineer, the solicitor, and then the acceptance of routine departmental reports.
That list makes perfect sense if the goal is just handling paperwork that doesn't really move policy.
Right.
But looking through the sources, that last item is interesting to me. Acceptance of routine department reports.
Hmm.
Doesn't that kind of open the door to slipping important details past the public, even if they aren't explicit policy votes?
That is a critical friction point. I mean, technically, a routine report like monthly police stats or a public works update, that's appropriate because it's just informational, not legislative.
But the key word there is routine.
Exactly. If a department report has some major unexpected expense buried on page 14, that should immediately be pulled out for discussion. The whole procedure assumes that everything's already been vetted.
And this brings us to the real-world scale of this bundling. We looked at the agenda for the January 14th, 2046 Board of Supervisors meeting.
And the sheer volume of spending they approved in one single swipe it's staggering.
It's a powerful illustration of that risk, that financial scope creep. So the single consent motion was set to approve 2 sets of minutes, which is normal.
Okay, standard.
But then you have 2 separate bills lists totaling almost $1 million.
$1 million.
Yeah, you had about $575,000 from late December and another $400,000 from January, plus transfers.
Wow. Approaching $1 million in financial commitments, greenlit in one motion. What are the practical implications of that for public oversight?
Well, you have to think, that amount represents dozens, maybe hundreds of individual payments to vendors that would normally be reviewed.
Right. For the public watching, this single motion turns what could be careful auditing into, 1 second of assumed trust. You just have to hope every single item in that bundle is completely legitimate.
And it wasn't just the bills. That same vote also covered specific final project payments.
Like what?
Things like a change order and the final payment certificate for some pedestrian upgrades and that rectangular rapid flashing beacon project.
Okay, and just to put that in context, these big capital projects with pedestrian upgrades are often funded at least in part by the state.
Through things like the Liquid Fuels Road program.
Precisely.
So this isn't just small internal township money. Not at all.
Yeah.
This is a major portion of the capital budget getting approved instantly. The public is right to question if a final payment on a big construction project really qualifies as, routine paperwork.
So if the volume and the cost can be that high, the safeguards become absolutely paramount.
They do.
A properly run consent agenda process is simple, but there's one step in there where democracy actually
But
happens.
let's walk through the 4 required steps.
Yeah.
Step 1, every item, no matter how routine, has to be listed individually on the agenda or in the packet. That's for visibility before the meeting.
Then step 2, and this is the democratic brake pedal. Before the vote, the chair has to ask if any supervisor wants to pull an item for separate discussion.
And that simple question is the whole mechanism for a challenge. It forces supervisors to actually exercise their oversight.
Right, if they see a questionable payment, they have to be able to isolate it.
And the board has to respect that.
So then, step 3, the board approves the remaining items with that single vote. And step 4, any item that got pulled gets handled later as a regular agenda item with full debate.
But this whole safeguard, it really relies entirely on the culture of the board, doesn't it?
It does, and that culture is what the research really put to the test. We found a perfect example of how that pulling mechanism can be tested.
This was related to an item that was in a draft agenda for a meeting back on November 25th, 2025.
Okay.
The item was authorization to purchase drug education vehicle and upfitting in the amount of $110,000 through co-stars using opioid settlement funds.
Wow, that is absolutely a high-dollar policy decision. That is not routine.
It wasn't. And some supervisors rightly flagged it as totally inappropriate for a consent agenda, so it had to be removed last minute.
So the safeguard worked.
It did, but what happened next is where the risk was exposed.
Yeah, I found that whole anecdote really concerning because it wasn't just that the item was inappropriate, it was the reported intent after it was pulled.
Right. The chair at the time reportedly said that the issue would be brought back in January 2026.
Specifically, when the 2 supervisors who had raised the objections would no longer be on the board.
And that moves beyond a simple procedural mistake. That highlights the risk of weaponizing efficiency.
It suggests a conscious attempt to bypass critical voices and public debate by just waiting for a board that's less likely to pull the item.
It's a chilling demonstration of how procedure can become political.
Okay, so we've established it can be dangerous, but let's pull back because the tool itself is, it's incredibly useful. We can't analyze the risks without respecting the benefits.
Of course.
So why did governments even adopt this procedure in the first place?
Well, primarily efficiency. Imagine a 4-hour meeting where the first hour is just someone reading every single check written that month.
Followed by a separate vote on every routine report. Yeah, that would be a drag.
The consent agenda just dramatically reduces that bureaucratic drag.
Yeah. And that doesn't just save the board's time, it improves the experience for residents, too. If a meeting goes from 4 hours down to 2, people are much more likely to stick around for the important stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which leads to the second big pro.
Yeah.
It lets you focus on substance.
Right.
A board's energy and a resident's patience, it's finite. By clearing the clutter, you free up time for the crucial matters, like public hearings, policy debates, resident concerns. It elevates the items that do need debate.
And third, there's predictability.
Yes, it helps everyone, staff, supervisors, the public, instantly distinguish what's routine from what needs real discussion. If your item isn't on the consent list, you know it's getting a full hearing.
The power of speed is undeniable, but as we've seen, every high-speed tool introduces risk. So let's shift back to that friction point. Where does this efficiency start to erode public trust?
Well, the primary risk, as we saw with that vehicle purchase attempt, is that transparency suffers. When the boundary of what's routine gets fuzzy, you enable big spending decisions to be rubber-stamped without any real debate.
And that feeds directly into the second risk.
Public awareness just drops. When you see those huge bills lists all lumped together, the public might not grasp the full weight of what was just approved. They're a perfect hiding spot for costs that, if isolated, might raise big questions.
Yeah, the background material had a great anecdote on this. A former supervisor noted having to specifically ask why the township was paying over $300,000 a year to a company called Barry Isid and Associates.
And that detail is exactly what we need to focus on. Barry Isid and Associates is a well-known regional engineering firm. So that level of spending is routine in its frequency. They get paid every month.
But it's massive in its scale.
Exactly. If that huge annual cost is always buried inside a $1 million bills list, it just becomes normalized. It's hidden from residents who might otherwise question the scale of those professional service contracts.
And that leads right into the third risk. Accountability gets blurry.
It does.
When one single vote covers 10 different actions and one of them turns out to be flawed, say that final payment on the flashing beacon was premature, it becomes almost impossible to track responsibility.
Supervisors can just claim they were voting on the routine bundle and shift the blame, rather than owning that one specific decision. It's subtle.
And it leads to that gradual, silent killer scope creep.
Yes, the research really emphasizes that. Over time, more significant items can just quietly migrate into the consent portion.
We saw that with the pedestrian upgrades and the flashing beacon payment in that January agenda.
Right, while it was a final payment, and so you could argue it was routine finance, putting it on consent just normalizes the idea that the board doesn't need to hear about major project completions anymore.
And that slow expansion of what's routine is where vigilance is needed most.
So if the consent agenda is going to work as a positive tool, boards have to follow some really clear guardrails. This isn't just about the law, it's about building a culture of openness.
Okay, so give us the best practices, the checklist for maintaining that trust.
First and foremost, clarity has to be non-negotiable. Every single consent item listed clearly, with backup documents published in advance. No vague labels like miscellaneous.
And making sure the public can actually read that material beforehand is critical.
Absolutely. So preparedness. Publish everything, the minutes, the bills, the contracts, well in advance. And second, input. Boards must allow public comment before the consent vote happens.
So residents have a chance to flag something they see as questionable.
Exactly, before the vote. But the single most important guardrail, especially after that drug vehicle story, has to be the culture of the board.
I agree.
It is. Supervisors have to be encouraged to pull items freely without any stigma or, political eye rolls from their peers.
If a supervisor pulls an item, it should be seen as them doing their job exercising oversight.
Not as them slowing the meeting down.
And finally, those essential boundaries.
Right. Land use decisions, personnel matters, major new policy, they never belong here. They have to be debated on their own. And tying it all together, boards need to periodically review what they define as routine.
Because if that definition is allowed to expand unchecked for years, you suddenly find yourself voting on high-dollar capital projects without a single word of public discussion.
That's the danger.
Okay, let's just unpack this one last time. We've seen that the consent agenda is this elegant, necessary tool designed to save time.
But every piece of evidence we've looked at shows it's constantly balancing on a knife's edge between moving quickly and sacrificing public awareness.
Right.
I mean, the bottom line is that the tool is a positive force when it's used responsibly. But the research warns us that when it's used carelessly or worse, deliberately, it erodes public confidence.
It limits discussion on decisions that absolutely deserve full televised attention.
Public business requires public trust, and trust requires visibility.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the engaged citizen. The research observed that more significant items may quietly migrate into the consent portion just out of habit or for expediency. So if periodically reviewing what qualifies as routine is a critical best practice, a job that's often left to the board itself, how would you, the person watching, ensure that the definition of routine in your local government doesn't just expand because it's easier? What structure or external pressure would you propose to keep that definition honest? Think about that before your next local meeting.